it doesn't begin with a needle, or a bottle, or even a pill. It begins in silence, the kind that hums beneath your skin when no one is watching, the kind that makes a man scroll through a screen at 3 a.m., not for pleasure, not even for distraction, but for something nameless, something that might remind him he's still alive. Addiction in its truest form is not always chemical. Sometimes it's ritual, a sacred substitute for the self, repeated not out of desire, but out of a quiet desperation to soothe an identity in ruins. We have misunderstood addiction. We've made it clinical, moralistic, criminal. But Carl Jung saw it differently. For him, addiction was never just about substances, it was about symbols. Every form of addiction is bad, he said, no matter whether the narcotic be alcohol or morphine or idealism. Idealism. Let that sink in. Jung wasn't speaking to the addict on the street. He was speaking to the perfectionist, the people-pleaser, the one who cannot stop fixing, helping, performing. Addiction in this light is the soul's distorted attempt at reintegration, a cry from the unconscious demanding to be made whole. And the addict, they're not simply lost. They're reaching, blindly, painfully, for symbolic wholeness in a world that taught them to fracture. Nietzsche sharpened this truth even further. He didn't speak of addiction as weakness, but as avoidance, as the will to escape, dressed up as survival. To numb oneself is not cowardice, it is a refusal to suffer consciously. And that refusal, it doesn't come from a lack of strength. It comes from the absence of initiation, the absence of a path to become. Most addicts don't lack willpower, they lack a rite of transformation. They don't know how to bleed with purpose, so they bleed in private. Then Falco whispered, from the shadows of society, that addiction is not merely an individual failure, but a systemic outcome. A society that worships balance, that sells wellness like a product, doesn't cure addiction, it camouflages it. We are told we're free while being medicated into docility. Sedation has become sophistication. Stillness has become pathology. In this environment, addiction doesn't grow from chaos. It grows from overregulation, from a life so organized, so productive, so curated, that it leaves no space for confrontation with the self. So let me ask you something you may have never dared to ask yourself. What if your addiction, whether it's to alcohol, approval, adrenaline, or avoidance, is not the problem? What if it's a symbol? What if it's the only voice your soul has left? This isn't about shame. This is about seeing. Because until you stop staring at the substance and start listening to the hunger beneath it, you'll keep reaching for something that was never meant to fill you. No one wakes up one day and decides to ruin their life. No one chooses dependency the way they choose a meal or a song. Addiction slips in like a shadow, not because you crave the substance, but because you fear the silence that arrives without it. The psyche doesn't cling to the bottle, or the screen, or the pill. It clings to the anesthesia, the sacred pause, that momentary escape from the unbearable confrontation with your own reflection. That's the real craving, not pleasure, but disappearance. Most people misunderstand what addiction protects. It's not just about numbing pain, it's about shielding identity. When you reach for that habit, whether it's nicotine or validation, you're not trying to feel good. You're trying to avoid what you might see if the noise ever stopped. Because beneath every addiction lies an encounter you've been postponing for years. The raw, unedited version of you, the one that wasn't accepted, the one that was too much, too angry, too needy, too real, the one you learned to exile just to survive. Every ritual of addiction is a coded message, a repeated attempt to delay recognition, a desperate rhythm to keep yourself from remembering who you really are or what happened to you. That's why quitting often feels like death, because it's not the drug you're letting go of, it's the scaffolding you built to avoid. Collapse. The real fear isn't withdrawal, it's exposure. You fear who you'd be without the distraction, without the thing that gives you an excuse not to feel, not to face, not to choose. And maybe, just maybe, without that escape, you'd have to deal with the silence you've buried your truth in. A silence so deep, it doesn't echo, it swallows. So, the question isn't, why are you addicted? The question is, what part of yourself are you running from? Because until you meet that version of you, the one beneath the performance, beneath the habit, beneath the numbness, the cycle continues. Different substances, same ache, same vanishing. The shadow is not your enemy. It's your echo. It's everything you were taught to hide, every impulse, every scream. Every truth you learned was too much for the world to handle. And when you don't listen to it, it doesn't disappear. It descends into the unconscious, into the basement of your psyche. There, it festers. and eventually it finds another way out. Addiction is often that way out. Carl Jung never saw the shadow as just darkness. He saw it as rejected light, brilliance twisted by repression. And when those exiled parts of you have no voice, they don't die, they mutate into compulsions, into obsessions, into cravings. Addictive behavior, then, is not just self-destructs. It's self-expression, distorted, disguised, desperate. It's your unconscious trying to bypass your moral filters and say, "Look at me, I'm still here." That's why some of your deepest addictions don't make logical sense. They're not rational, they're archetypal, because they weren't born from choice. They were born from censorship. The moment you swallowed your rage, your need for control, your hunger for attention, you created a gap, and addiction rushed in to fill it, not because it's evil, but because it's loyal. The shadow is loyal. It will always find a way to be seen. The tragedy is not that you have a shadow. The tragedy is that you've been taught to fight it instead of integrate it, that you've moralized what needed to be understood, that you labeled your wildness as weakness, and in doing so, you gave it no home except addiction. So what if you stopped asking, "Why can't I quit?" and started asking, "What have I silenced that's trying to speak?" Because behind every compulsive ritual is a voice, a need, a truth you were told was dangerous. And addiction, that's the shadow screaming for individuation. It doesn't want to destroy you. It wants to remake you, but only if you're brave enough to listen. You say you want peace. You repeat it like a prayer in therapy, in journals, in midnight thoughts. But when peace arrives, it doesn't calm you. It agitates you. It makes you restless. It makes you crave the edge. Because deep down, you know something most people won't admit. Destruction feels more honest than stillness. At least, in destruction, you feel something. At least in chaos, the numbness breaks. The truth is, you don't really want calm. You want release. You want to be unshackled from the roles, the masks, the suffocating civility of who you're expected to be. And sometimes, the only way you've found to do that is to set a match to the whole illusion. That's the hidden appeal of addiction. It's not the substance, it's the shattering. It's the escape from a self that no longer feels like home. There is a silent joy in destruction, not because you enjoy hurting yourself, but because pain becomes the only place where your truth is allowed to exist. Peace without authenticity is a cage, a manicured prison where nothing is wrong, and yet everything is suffocating. And the addict knows this, not consciously, but viscerally. That's why peace never lasts. That's why the return to chaos feels like relief. It's not pleasure. It's alignment, however dark. The high isn't just an escape. It's a resurrection. A brief moment where you rise above the weight of unspoken expectations and touch something raw, something real, something unfiltered. And even though it burns, at least it's yours. That's why you crave destruction more than serenity. Because destruction doesn't lie to you. It doesn't require a mask. It doesn't punish intensity. In that moment, even if it's fleeting, you meet a version of yourself that's not edited, not acceptable, but alive. And maybe, just maybe, that version is the one who's been waiting for your permission to exist. We've been taught to see the addict as broken, as weak, as someone who lost control. But what if they didn't lose control? What if they were never offered a path to true sovereignty in the first place? What if the addicted self isn't a failure of will, but a failure of initiation? In ancient cultures, pain was sacred. Transformation required descent. Suffering had structure. It led somewhere. But in the modern world, suffering is sanitized. We treat it like a disease to be erased, not a passage to be endured. And so the addict is left wandering, uninitiated, unrecognized, a spiritual refugee in a culture that has forgotten how to mark the thresholds of becoming. They're not just chasing highs, they're chasing rights, moments that could have shaped them, tested them, revealed them, but never came. So they create their own, through fire, through collapse, through repetition. And though these rituals destroy the body, they often carry a deeper yearning to be reborn, to break through the numbness and remember what it means to feel. The system doesn't see this. It offers sedation instead of sovereignty, medication instead of meaning, and while that might manage the symptoms, it never heals the wound, because the wound was never just about behavior. It was about abandonment, not just by people, but by purpose. Addiction becomes a corrupted rite of passage, a hijacked form of self-initiation in a world that teaches you to be productive, but not powerful, polite, but not whole, functional, but not free. So the addict improvises. They descend alone, without guidance, without elders, without maps. And when they return, if they return, we don't welcome them. We judge them. We label them. We miss the sacredness of their suffering. But beneath the wreckage, something persists, a hidden dignity, a whisper that they were never meant to die this way. The addict itself, for all its chaos, is still reaching toward something holy, toward the real, toward the self that was buried but never erased. They are not weak. They are exiled mystics, rejected prophets of their own psyche, and until we see them as such, we will continue to mistake their fire for failure when it may be the very thing trying to save them. There is a kind of morality that doesn't liberate, it suffocates. A morality that doesn't heal, it humiliates. One that whispers not from the soul, but from the system, you should be ashamed of your pain. And so many addicts aren't just fighting cravings, they're drowning in guilt. A guilt that was never theirs to carry. A guilt that was engineered. Adorno warned us, in a society built on performance. Guilt becomes a mechanism of control. You don't conform because it's right. You conform because you're afraid of being seen as wrong. And in that space, the addict is not just isolated, they're gaslight. Made to feel morally defective for not coping the way others do, for feeling too deeply, for reacting to an insane culture with symptoms that are, in many ways, sane. Because what is addiction if not an honest response to an emotionally dishonest world? You're told to meditate your way out of trauma, to smile through collapse, to self-care your way back to productivity. But what if your addiction isn't a deviation from the norm? What if it's an exposure of how sick the norm has become? And what if the guilt you carry isn't yours but implanted? A reflex trained by a society that punishes intensity, passion, and truth. Many addicts aren't broken, they're morally confused. Not because they've lost their compass, but because they were taught to aim it away from themselves, toward obedience, toward acceptance, toward the illusion of normal. And when they failed to fit, the system didn't ask why. It blamed, it shamed, it called their fire a flaw. But guilt is not a guide, it's a leash. And healing doesn't come from behaving better, it comes from reclaiming what was stolen. The right to feel without being punished, the right to hurt without being labeled, the right to search without being silenced. So maybe the question is not, how do I fix myself? Maybe the real question is, who told me I was wrong for breaking under the weight of a world that refuses to feel? Because until that voice is named, it will keep whispering, it will keep binding, and you will keep confusing obedience with worth, when all along, it was the guilt, not the addiction, that kept you trapped. You've been taught to see your addiction as a flaw, a personal failure, a shameful curse. But what if it's something else entirely? What if your addiction is not a mistake, but a message, a symbolic system that your unconscious built when language wasn't safe enough, when truth had to hide, when pain needed a disguise just to survive? The cigarette is not just tobacco, it's the breath you never took for yourself, the inhale you were too afraid to claim, the exhale that carries all the words you swallowed to keep the peace. The bottle isn't just alcohol, it's the fire you were never allowed to express, the sacred rage, the untamed grief, the silent screams that had no permission to exist. The scrolling isn't just distraction, it's the silence you were never taught to hold, the void that terrifies you, because no one showed you how to sit in it without disappearing. Addictions, in this light, aren't pathologies, they're poetry. Broken, raw, dangerous poetry. But poetry nonetheless. They speak in symbols. They act out what was never allowed to be said. They translate trauma into action, repression into ritual. And that's why they're so hard to kill. Because you're not just removing a habit, you're dismantling a code. A language your psyche learned in order to feel alive in a world that didn't know how to see you. To call it a curse is to miss the intelligence beneath the chaos, the sacred architecture of the symptom. Addiction carries meaning, not moral failure, but metaphoric truth. And until you interpret that truth, you will keep cycling through symptoms, chasing cures that never touch the root dot. So what if you stopped asking, how do I get rid of this? And started asking, what is this trying to tell me? Because inside every craving is a clue, inside every pattern is a path, not back to who you were, but forward to who you were meant to become. And maybe the gift was never in the quitting. Maybe the gift was in the seeing, the decoding, the listening. Because once you understand the symbol, the curse dissolves, not because you fought it, but because you finally recognized what it came to show you. Addiction ends not when the substance disappears, but when the silence is no longer unbearable. When you stop fixating on the bottle, the blade, the screen, and begin tracing the voice behind the craving, the voice that never left you. The voice that's been whispering through every breakdown, every relapse, every hidden ritual. Jung said that individuation, the process of becoming whole, begins the moment we stop projecting and start listening. And nowhere is this more urgent than in addiction, because the substance is never the root. It's the mask, the ritual, the misinterpreted prayer. Every addiction is a map, not a linear one, but symbolic, chaotic, fragmented, ancient, a trail of moments where yourself tried to speak and was silenced, tried to scream and was medicated, tried to break and was told to be strong. But the break wasn't a failure, it was a beginning. Nietzsche's voice cuts through the haze with brutal precision. He who despises himself still respects himself as one who despises. In other words, even self-hatred is a form of contact. Even in your darkest spiral, you're still in relationship with yourself. Inverted, yes. Destructive, yes, but alive, and that matters. Because it means the thread is not broken, it's tangled. And anything tangled can be traced. Foucault reminds us that rebellion is often disguised as pathology. That society doesn't just suppress you, it teaches you to suppress yourself and then calls that sanity. But sedation is not healing. Compliance is not freedom. True reintegration doesn't come through moral obedience or clinical recovery. It comes through symbolic resurrection, through the refusal to keep mistaking your symptoms for your identity. You are not diseased. You are not defective. You are a phoenix misidentified as ash, and your addiction, for all its destruction, might be the only part of you that refused to die quietly, the only part that still burns. So, the real question is not how do I stop? The real question is, what is the fire I keep running from? Because maybe, just maybe, that fire is where you finally meet yourself. Not the version others approved of, not the version you curated to survive, but the one who was forged to live.